You don't need to try to oversell the sustainability aspect. Consumer bought it. Okay, I understand this. This is a plus. Okay, but let's go back to the basics here. Is this product doing what it's supposed to do at a reasonable price, the reasonable quality? And we should never forget that. And you mentioned, for instance, the aspect of durability. Durability is one of the core aspects of performance, right? How long is this going to last? It has a tremendous sustainability benefit as well. But if the consumer is doing this because it lasts, not necessarily because it's sustainable, that's fine.
This is Professor Eduardo Andrade, Professor of Marketing at Imperial College Business School. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN, and your host of Lives of Tomorrow, where we explore how shifts in society, ethics, and the economy are shaping the future. So this is the second instalment in our sustainability series as we celebrate a decade of the WGSN Sustainability Board, a group made up of the experts within our company on the topic of sustainability and the environment, all working together to drive positive impact. So here's something that might genuinely surprise you, or maybe you've kind of seen it already. When we're asked, most of us say that we genuinely care about sustainability and the environment. But then when it comes down to actually practicing that, when it comes down to making shopping and product decisions, the reality isn't always aligned with that. So today we are going to dig into the uncomfortable truth. Do consumers actually care about sustainability anymore, or is it just talk? To help me tackle this topic, I'm joined by Professor of Marketing at Imperial Business School, Eduardo Andrade. So Eduardo, a big welcome to the podcast. Let's start with you introducing yourself to our listeners.
So hi everybody, I'm Eduardo Andrade. I'm a professor of marketing at the Imperial Business School, and my specialty is sustainable consumption.
At WGSN, we talk about the say-do gap a lot. I'm quite obsessed with the say-do gap because there are lots of agencies out there who totally rely on consumer surveys. And consumer surveys definitely have their place. But consumers often say one thing and do something very, very different. And the piece of research which you are behind, I think, validates a lot of that say-do gap. So can you start by explaining a little bit more about the report that you're putting out and the nuances that you've seen under that theme?
So in one of the studies, what we've done is that we put people in actual consumption activities. Imagine that have this amount of money, now go to a website, buy certain products and so on. And when they came back, then we asked them, tell me, what did you take into consideration when you were buying these products? So we didn't say anything about sustainability. We didn't say that the research was about sustainability. We just said, we want to understand what you care, what you don't care when you're making purchases. And invariably, what we observed was actually not that surprising, at least from a marketer point of view, is that, well, they report that they care a lot about price, that they care a lot about functional quality, that they care a lot about convenience, taste, and so on and so forth, depending on the product category. Price by a landslide dominated, and then depending on the product, a lot of other stuff would be related to perceived quality, brand, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, in one of the studies, actually, we list all the possible attributes that might be taken into consideration. And among them, we put the product's environmental impact. Again, it was there, but it was among the 10 of 10 attributes that it could take into consideration. And guess what? Very few people click that one. So actually, if you look across, when we published this article, which is essentially about sustainability considerations in consumer decision making, on average, 10 to 15% of consumers were taking that into account, explicitly saying that we're taking that into account. And we did this on the web, we did this face-to-face in several different ways, actually in different countries as well. And we observed the same pattern. We may see some variance across countries. The other thing that we do observe is that there is a niche there that is genuinely more willing to consider it. So there's a scale that's called the biospheric values scale. So how much do you care about nature and protecting the environment? So people who score higher in that scale and who had that scale were more likely to spontaneously consider. But that is a niche. For the vast majority, what you say is that people are not spontaneously considering. Okay, so that is part of the answer to, okay, are people considering this? Now, let's ask the question, okay, even when they consider, Okay, it comes to my mind that I should take this into account. Then there are multiple other barriers that might be preventing them from acting more sustainably.
Cool. So it's not that 10 to 15% of people are saying it's a priority or it's a consideration, and therefore I will buy with a more sustainable slant on it. That's just a consideration, and then I guess you're going to say you get a further drop off after that.
That's right. We don't do this in the same study, but then we start mapping and then theoretically say, look, and that's where the value action gap or the attitude behavior gap or the green gap comes into play. Is that it's not that they are many of them who are saying this and might be saying this genuinely. So in principle, I do care. Okay. But there are many other attributes that I do take into consideration, and there are many obstacles that might be preventing me from acting more sustainably, even if I genuinely care about it. Okay? And then we start mapping this, and we can organize them into essentially 3 groups. One group is called the market barriers. So if you think about comparing products that are more sustainable versus less sustainable in general. So in general, the more sustainable option tends to be more expensive. Assuming that I care a lot about price, that's a huge barrier. The other aspect is that, and we call the sustainability liability effect, is that many consumers hold the belief that sustainable products are not as effective as their conventional counterparts. So you think about the cleaning products is a very good example. A lot of consumers hold the belief that the cleaning product is not as effective cleaning if it's a more sustainable, a greener one than if it's not. So if I think about only these two, price and quality, then the sustainable version already is at disadvantage on average. Of course, there are exceptions to that, and we can talk about how we overcome this.
Was there anything when you were going through the research that surprised you, that or really was it a validation of a point of view that you went in with at the beginning?
So yes, there are many of those. One that keeps popping up, and when I talk to people, is this notion that there are particular segments that are really, really concerned about the environment more than others. And so the younger generation is much more sustainable than the older generation, for instance. This is true for certain products, for certain activities, but for instance, when we measure sustainability considerations, spontaneous sustainability considerations, age was not a strong predictor. Education was, age was not. So it's not that all the young people, for the many products that they buy, they are spontaneously thinking about that. You do have a niche, and it may apply to certain products, but for other products, it's not the case. May not be the case at all.
Which products did it? I would be interested. So let's just say Gen Z, just for, label a youngish generation, not the youngest. But what areas were they more sustainability focused?
We don't observe a clear trend of age or clear impact of age on people's willingness to consider more. But you can think intuitively that, for instance, and you can see the city of London, in which secondhand market is a vibrant market, and that the younger generation is more willing to buy secondhand clothing than the older generation. This is possibly true, right? It's likely to be true. But this is not true in all areas, right? Is this true when you are taking the airplane versus the train? Is this true when you are doing several other activities, or when you want to buy the cheaper product also for other reasons rather than because it's secondhand, and so on and so forth? So I think there's a lot of generalizations about that. If you go deep into that, this is not necessarily what you observe in the real world.
Why did you do the research? Was it because you wanted to educate brands so that they could think about how they could help consumers? Or was it because you were concerned that people just didn't really realize the extent of the problem?
I think there are two answers to that. The first is that, so I've been trained in marketing my entire life, and in consumer psychology more specifically, which is one of the branches, market consumer behavior, consumer psychology. And I think this is an area in which marketing can contribute tremendously, right? So we always think of marketing on the negative side in that spectrum. It is true, it can do a lot of damage and has done a lot of damage, but the flip side is also true. Because if this is all about changing, helping changing, persuading consumers to go in one direction versus the other direction, the same tools that are used to nudge them into one direction can be nudged for them in the other direction. Now, what is also important is by looking at that, I think it's very important that we have a proper diagnostic diagnosis of what's indeed driving consumer behavior, because I think it can be very dangerous and not very beneficial to companies if you keep selling the idea that consumers want more sustainable products. We should sell more sustainable products because that's what the marketing is demanding them.
Yeah, because I think if it is just so simplistic that consumers are passionate about sustainability, which I think we could probably still argue that they are, again, coming back to if you ask someone, do you care about the planet, the environment? The vast majority of people are going to say yes. Maybe not some politicians, but, normal human beings probably would do. But then, a brand pivots its product strategy to do that and then sees sales decline, then you are not going to see that investment coming in the future from big companies. And we need that because the planet needs it.
And the fundamental principle of marketing is to be customer-centric. So what do? We start trying to understand the consumer as much as we can. And then we do a lot of marketing research. And then we get all this knowledge and we put into price, into product, into placement, into merchandising, into promotion. And if you do this properly, we offer this to the consumer is going to be satisfied. And if you do this better than the competition, that's what good marketing is all about. Now, the question when I present this to students, okay, where does sustainability fit into this framework here? And then some say, well, because when I do my marketing research, I'm going to realize that the consumer care about sustainability, and I'm going to incorporate this into the product, into the price, and so on and so forth. And then the next question is, so what happens if consumers don't? Or if they care more about others? And that's where I think, and I break this down into, look, there are two centricity problems here. One, you have to be customer-centric, and the other have to be nature-centric, right? And these two are not necessarily positively correlated, unfortunately. So we have to realize there is this potential trade-off between being customer-centric and being nature-centric. And our challenge as marketers, as companies, and as policymakers as well, is to make sure that you can align these incentives, can align these two needs, the needs of the nature and the needs of the customer. Because if you satisfy one and does not satisfy the other, irrespective of which one you're satisfying, it's not going to work and be more sustainable.
Do you think that, the piece that you've done now, which is with a marketing angle, but can you see a world where that does help influence policy decision? And is there an outlet for it? Because you're right, without that, then still this is so difficult.
I would say that probably the European Union is taking the lead on the regulations and the changes in regulations when to come to promoting sustainability in general. But many of these regulations are directly targeted to changing consumer behavior. And the way we can help is that, okay, what would be the ideal ones and which ones work best, which ones are more challenging, and so on and so forth. But this interaction between the society, academics, industry, and policymaking, they are very important to make the right decisions on what the ideal policies that would be there and would flourish and promote sustainable consumption.
We often come at this more from a product perspective. A lot of WGSN subscribers are product creators. And what we've been saying to them is you've got to think of the and, because if you just think sustainability, you are cutting out a large part of the market. And from your research, it's even larger than perhaps anybody is aware at the moment. So ours is that sustainability needs to be a factor, but you need to offer the consumer other reasons to buy that product.
When you do the marketing communication of a sustainable product, what should you communicate? What should you highlight? Right? From an environmental standpoint, nature doesn't care about consumers' intentionality. It cares about consumer behavior, right? So whether you're doing this intentionally or not, from an environmental standpoint, doesn't really matter. Of course, for societal point view, it can matter, it can scale. However, what we see when we start looking at the data or how companies were promoting sustainable products relative to their conventional counterparts, okay? And what you see often is that they highlight a lot about the sustainability aspect. It's good for the planet, it's this and this, trying to convince consumers that this is really, really sustainable. But there's a constraint. Sometimes the constraint is space. Sometimes there are constraints. You have to decide which piece of information you put in there, right? What you communicate, whether in a package or in a website or whatever. And in communicating their sustainability, they tend to forget to communicate the functionality of the product, right? Because there is this trade-off. And because we know that consumers may question sometimes the functionality of the sustainable product, then you get into a problem, right? So with our research, what we are observing is very, very, very clear that we have to balance these two things. And sometimes even saying about a sustainable product, you don't need to try to oversell the sustainability aspect. Consumer bought it. Okay, I understand this. This is a plus. Okay, but let's go back to the basics here. Is this product doing what it's supposed to do at the reasonable price, the reasonable quality? And we should never forget that. And you mentioned, for instance, the aspect of durability. Durability is one of the core aspects of performance, right? How long is this going to last? It has a tremendous sustainability benefit as well. But if the consumer is doing this because it lasts, not necessarily because it's sustainable, that's fine. But I want to make sure that all I care is about how much this product is going to last, how much it's going to perform, how effective this is, and this should not be forgotten at the expense of me trying to sell the sustainability of it. Although, as a passionate marketer or sustainable, I want to say about, look, this is all good that we've done here and so on and so forth. But by the end of the day, we should not forget that consumers care a lot about the basic stuff that's offered by that product. And we should satisfy those basic needs before we move to the sustainability aspect.
Amazing. Right. Quickly, we're going to do some quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit better. And then we're going to think about the future of this whole topic. Sure. So what is the book you're currently recommending?
One of the books that for me was the most influential is called The Limits to Growth.
Okay.
Which is a book written in 1972 by a group of researchers at MIT. And essentially, they are among the first to say, look, at this current level of consumption and economic growth, nature won't be able to sustain it, even with all the technological advancements that we expect that are going to have. And they wrote this in 1972.
Okay. What's your favorite AI tool?
I started with ChatGPT. I've moved to Gemini now.
A more fun one. What's the song you've currently got on repeat?
Not one particular song, but my youngest daughter loves Lei Fei. We went to her show here in London, so I'm learning a lot about it.
Oh, brilliant. And what was the last thing you ticked off your bucket list?
Finally, we are writing a book on sustainable consumption. The first time after having written a lot of articles, we got an agreement with the publisher, signed the contract. The book is almost finished, the first draft, and it's essentially about what we're talking about here. So next year, this book will be published, and I'll be proud of it, I hope.
Congratulations. That's very exciting. Okay, well, then I'm going to help you with some of your chapters of the book.
Thank you.
And ask you to look to the future. If you think 5-10 years ahead, how do you think consumer behavior will change around sustainability?
The reality is, and it's a bit of a grim reality, is that things are not going to get better on the environmental front. So this is a given. For the next 10, 20 years, talk to any climate scientist. This is going to get worse until it stabilizes and hopefully get better. That's a fight we're in. So the question is that as things become worse on the environmental front, how are consumers going to respond? The data seem to suggest, then there's a lot of interesting data on that as consumers, as people experience extreme events, their sustainability and their climate considerations tend to go up. So if this is true, and unfortunately we are going to feel this more and more, so this is not something of the future, this is happening, I suspect that sustainability considerations, climate change considerations are going to we are going to see variance probably, but on average is going to get more and more important.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think that, if you lived in the parts of Los Angeles which had those horrific fires last year, or you lived in Greece and sort of saw, large wildfires again, kind of destroying, I was going to say habitats, but livelihoods as well. If you have witnessed that you would imagine that your consumption habits change in at least the immediate future of those things happening.
That's right. This is the environmental concern is already going up. The type of consumer behavior that's changing, we don't know that much yet, but I can tell you a personal experience. The reason why I decided to devote most of my research to sustainable consumption was also a result of a personal experience on that front. So we were talking about fire. We were in Australia when there was a huge fire at the end of 2019.
Yeah.
And we saw the smoke entering our home.
Oh, wow.
And I thought it was fog, but then it was smelling not right. And so, this is smoke. we were in Sydney, that were coming from the bushfires and then reaching the city. And then we went to the mall, and you could see that the mall was actually a little bit foggy because there was actually. So, and then I saw, look, there's a consumption, this is happening. This is real. This is very tangible now. And that's, for me, was also a bit of a switch and say, oh, look, I have to devote most of my research to that topic because I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon, and it's very important.
Do you think that there are other things? So we're talking there quite specifically about, the environment changing. In the research that you've done, or maybe as you're thinking to the future, do you think there are other things? I guess I'm thinking a little bit from a sort of fashion perspective, that again, consumers will say that, they don't want fashion that is created in a bad way, a bad place where people might be being exploited, but then will go and buy very, very cheap products. And the reality is the only reason that they are that cheap is of the way that they are created. Do you think right now and into the future that attitude will change? Or do you think, again, it's just because it's cost first?
Part of the reason is that it's very hard to change if it's not translated into price. However, it's also true that we don't have enough information on that. And that's where policymaking, digital product passports, all these aspects can play a role and can help us out a lot. Not only help us out, but also help governments track the environmental and the social aspects associated with the entire value chain, and how we can promote sustainable consumption by making all this information more accessible, salient, transparent to everybody, to all the players on the market. I think this can make a big difference.
Let's talk a little bit about the digital product passports, because I've also recorded another podcast almost entirely dedicated to that topic, because it could be completely transformational. What do you think consumer behavior or attitudes towards that, or does it come back in this instance that this is a policy making, this is going to be the stick that drives industries and consumers will benefit as a consequence, but they're not really the driving force on this one?
On the aspect of who is driving the change, the policy making, if a label is implemented, it does produce two effects. It does make a label or digital passport. It does make the information more readily available to the consumer, but it also makes it more readily available to everybody else. And so companies have an incentive to not be the worst in their group. Governments have an incentive to track if whatever the company is saying is accurate or not. And consumers now have information to choose between products that perform better or worse in that dimension that they could not see beforehand, right? So that is there. The other thing, one thing that concerns me a little bit, is that I don't think we should replace some of the labels that are already there with the digital passport, because the digital passport requires the consumer to act, right? And to put the QR code there and look at and that also is an extra step that I suspect many consumers won't do it if you know as much as we know about it. However, the digital product passport has many other benefits, including advice about repair, about recyclability, a lot of piece of information that no other label would be able to provide you with. So that provides a lot of benefit. The challenge with that is the challenge of data access and management. Okay. However, that's why if policymaking doesn't get into that and say, look, we got to do this, I'm going to start with the big companies, where I think in the EU they started with batteries. That was the first, and then they move into other product categories slowly. I think until 2030, many product categories of products that are sold in the EU will have to have the QR code and the digital passport. I think this is going to be transformational. I have no doubt about this, but not only because the consumer is going to act on it. It's because this is going to change the incentives to many of the players in the system, and including the consumers.
Yeah, the companies for where this is really kind of knotted into their DNA. Let's take a Patagonia as a great example, and sort of well recognized and well known, but this genuinely is core to their proposition, and they do very, very well, because the product's good as well. They have never deviated from that. So there are some really good case studies here to continue on this trajectory, on this journey to becoming a more sustainable product creating business. But I think, then there are also, I'm a CEO as well, what's your deliverables this month, this quarter? And that can sometimes overtake other wishes and needs if you're in that world.
And that's why I think so in Patagonia always comes up as a very good example of that. But the entire fashion industry is quite problematic in that, right? And we know that. And we are doing a lot of research in Imperial College in general of trying to say, okay, how do we investigate this entire industry? Because even if we talk about one company, we need everybody there to be on board. And that's also, again, how important governments are and regulation is, because it's very hard for you to go against the flow if there's no regulation to help you out. And this happens for clothing, but it happens for every other sector. Think about the secondhand market. What the potential is huge. And also, here's a good example. The secondhand market is a very good example in which you have a product that's more sustainable and cheaper, which is usually not the case. So there is this low-hanging fruit. Of course, there's the change in the perceived quality and so on and so forth. We're doing a lot of research on that front as well. But if you talk to people in that industry, they complain a lot about that the regulation is not there to help them out. The regulation is there to facilitate the linear rather than the circular mindset. And that's important that we change as well.
So my final question to you, with everything that you know, with all of the research that you've done, are you more anxious or hopeful about the future?
I'm anxious in the sense that we know from the data that things are on the environmental front. Things are not going to get better now. They are going to get a little bit worse. We hope they don't get much worse, and then they stabilize and get better. So unfortunately, this is a given. However, we also know that more and more people are realizing this, and key players are realizing this. And despite all the bumps and despite all the discourse, there is movement in there. And then we are learning more on how to do this. And that even exactly this discussion that we are having right now. A couple of years ago, if I were to say this, look, consumers don't care too much about sustainability as much as we would have liked. And I would have pushed back as if I were against the cause by saying this. And so, no, we have to have the proper diagnosis here and see how we can make the strategic decisions that are going to promote sustainable consumption. And I think now the discourse is more in line with that. And I think this interaction that we're having is empirical evidence to that, so things are not as simple as that. There are trade-offs. There's the nature-centric approach, the customer-centric approach. These two things are not positively correlated. We have to make them work. How do we do this, and how is the best way of doing this? Because there is this greater goal that we have to attain, and we are not attaining this for altruistic reasons. Even if you're purely egoistic, as long as you're rational, we should go into that direction, right?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm absolutely delighted we're able to have this conversation. We wanted to run a series of podcasts around sustainability because WGSN has had a sustainability board for 10 years this month. And I know, because this is what we do, we research consumer behaviour, that there is this say-do gap, coming back to where I started. And I wanted somebody who I could talk to about this. And it's very difficult to find, because most people who work in sustainability want the message to just be, this is what consumers need, this is what they want, and this is what you must do. And I think that if that's the only conversation we're having, then people are not going to be successful, and therefore they will not continue to invest into sustainability measures. So I'm so grateful for the piece of work you've done, and that, we were able to have this quite frank, honest conversation with hopefully some positive outcomes from it.
Oh, I think that's fantastic, Carla. Thanks a lot, and congratulations on the 10-year of this adventure there. I'm sure that you had a lot of bumps in the road as well, but I think we should definitely push more of this discussion and this agenda, because it's important that we have a better understanding of what consumers care, how we can persuade them into acting more sustainably, whether intentionally or not.
A big thank you to today's guest, Professor Eduardo Andrade. Now, if you were fascinated by today's conversation and you're a WGSN subscriber, do make sure you read our Sustainability and Innovation Digital Product Passport Forecast. That's it from me today. Do check out our other podcast, Create Tomorrow, with my colleague Cassandra Napoli. I'll be back with a new episode of Lives of Tomorrow in 14 days' time. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN, and I'll see you next time.